The schoolhouse door banged open with such force that Miss Ruth Reynolds thought the hinges might finally give way, and she looked up from her primer to see the largest man she had ever laid eyes on ducking through the frame, his massive shoulders nearly filling the doorway as autumn sunlight streamed in behind him. It was September of 1876, and Dillon, Montana, was still raw and untamed, a place where silver and cattle brought fortune seekers and trouble in equal measure. Ruth had arrived 6 months earlier, fresh from a teaching college in Philadelphia, armed with idealism and determination that had slowly eroded under the weight of disrespect, dismissal, and the constant struggle to maintain order in a classroom where half the students were taller than she was and twice as ornery. The man stood there for a long moment, his weathered face partially obscured by dark hair that fell past his shoulders, tangled with what looked like wind and wilderness. His buckskin jacket stretched tight across a chest that seemed carved from granite, and his arms, visible where the sleeves ended, were corded with muscle that spoke of years hauling traps and wrestling nature into submission. He had to be well over 6 feet tall, probably closer to 6.5, and Ruth found herself frozen in place, chalk still raised to the blackboard where she had been writing out arithmetic problems. "Can I help you?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady even as every student in the room turned to gawk at the stranger. "Name is Garrett Cole," the man said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. "I am here to learn." A snicker rippled through the classroom. Bobby Hutchins, 17 and the ringleader of disruption, leaned back in his chair with a grin. "You got to be joshing, mister. You are older than my pa." Garrett Cole's dark eyes swept over the boy with a look that could have frozen a river in July, and Bobby's chair legs hit the floor with a thump. "I was not speaking to you, boy." Ruth felt something shift in the air, a subtle change in the dynamic that had been plaguing her since she arrived. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Cole, this is a school for children and young adults learning their letters and numbers. I'm not certain this is the appropriate venue for your education." "I can pay," he said simply, reaching into his jacket pocket and producing a small leather pouch that jingled with coins. Silver, a month in advance. The practical side of Ruth's mind calculated quickly. The school board provided her with a meager salary and expected her to supplement it with whatever fees she could collect from families. Most paid in goods if they paid at all, garden vegetables and cuts of meat that barely sustained her. Silver was a rare luxury. But more than that, something in the way this mountain man held himself, in the straightforward honesty of his gaze, made her hesitate. There was no mockery in his eyes, no condescension. He looked at her the way he might look at a preacher or a doctor, someone whose skills commanded respect. "Very well," she heard herself say. "But I expect you to follow the same rules as every other student. You will arrive on time, complete your lessons, and treat this classroom with respect." "Yes, madam," Garrett said, and Ruth was surprised to see him actually mean it. Finding a desk for him proved impossible. The furniture was built for children, and after watching him try to fold his considerable frame into one of the small chairs, Ruth finally directed him to sit on the bench near the window where she sometimes sat to read during lunch. Even there, he looked out of place, like a grizzly bear trying to take tea in a parlor. The other students could not stop staring. Ruth had 15 pupils ranging from 6-year-old Emma Mitchell, who was just learning her alphabet, to 19-year-old Sarah Brennan, who came twice a week when her family could spare her from farm work. None of them had ever seen anything quite like Garrett Cole sitting attentively with his hands folded on his knees, watching Ruth with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "We will continue with our arithmetic lesson," Ruth announced, turning back to the blackboard. If I have 3 yards of fabric and I need to make 4 dresses, each requiring 2 yards, how much more fabric do I need? She called on Jenny Foster, who stammered through an incorrect answer. Then on Bobby Hutchins, who shrugged and said he did not care about dresses. This was the usual pattern, the slow erosion of her authority as students realized she had no real power to enforce consequences beyond stern words and disappointed looks. 8 yards. Garrett's deep voice cut through the restless murmuring. You start with 3, need 8 total, so you are short 5 yards. Ruth turned to look at him, surprised. That is correct, Mr. Cole, though the question asked how much more was needed. 5 yards more, he amended. I apologize. I am still working out how to show my thinking properly, Ruth corrected gently, and was even more surprised when he nodded and repeated the word correctly. The rest of the morning passed in a strange new rhythm. Garrett asked questions when he did not understand, wrote painstakingly on the slate she provided him, and worked through problems with a focused determination that Ruth had rarely seen in her other students. More remarkably, his presence seemed to cast a spell over the usual troublemakers. Bobby Hutchins actually completed his assignments. The Martin twins stopped launching spitballs. Even lazy Timothy Crow made it through his reading passage without complaint. It was as if the mountain man's respect for her had somehow transferred to the others, showing them by example that Miss Reynolds was worthy of their attention. When she dismissed the class for lunch, the students scattered into the bright September day, eager to make the most of their brief freedom. Garrett remained at his bench, still working on the writing exercise she had assigned. Ruth unpacked her small lunch, bread and cheese she had bought from the mercantile, and tried not to watch him too obviously as he formed letters with painful concentration. His hands were huge, scarred and calloused from hard living, and the pencil looked like a twig between his thick fingers. Yet he persisted, crossing out mistakes and starting again without frustration. Mr. Cole, she finally said, may I ask what brought you to my classroom today? He looked up, dark eyes meeting hers. Up close, she could see he was probably in his early 30s, though the weathering of outdoor life made it hard to tell. There was a scar through his left eyebrow, another along his jaw. His face was all hard planes and sharp angles, handsome in a rough-hewn way that made her think of cliff faces and ancient trees. I have spent 15 years in these mountains, he said. Trapping, hunting, trading with the Shoshone and the Crow. I can track an elk through snow, skin a beaver in under a minute, and survive a winter with nothing but what I carry on my back. But I cannot read a contract, cannot write a letter, cannot do figures beyond what I can count on my fingers. He set down the pencil and looked at his hands as if they had betrayed him. 3 weeks ago, I came to town to sell my furs. Trader offered me a contract for next season, exclusive rights to sell through him. Said it was a good deal, best I would get. I had to take his word for it because I could not read what the paper said. Signed it anyway, figured a handshake and a man's word still meant something. Ruth waited, sensing there was more to the story. Found out later he was cheating me, Garrett continued, his voice hardening. Paying me half what my furs were worth, written right there in the contract. Other trappers laughed at me for being fool enough to sign without reading. Said I got what I deserved for being ignorant. He met her eyes again, and Ruth saw a fierce pride there, wounded but not broken. I am tired of being ignorant, Miss Reynolds. I am tired of being cheated because I cannot do what a child can do. So I am here to learn if you will teach me. Something in Ruth's chest tightened. She had come to Dillon full of noble ideas about education and the transforming power of knowledge, only to be met with apathy and barely concealed contempt. The town council tolerated her because territorial law required them to provide schooling, but they made it clear they considered her an unnecessary expense. The fathers dismissed her as a silly Eastern girl playing at being useful. The mothers were only marginally more polite. Even her own students treated her lessons as an inconvenient interruption to their real lives. But here was a man who understood exactly what she had been trying to tell them all along. Education was not frivolous. It was power. It was protection. It was dignity. "I will teach you, Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "and I am honored that you asked." Something shifted in his expression, a subtle softening that made him look younger. "I am the one who is honored, madam. I have been watching this town treat you poorly since you arrived. You deserve better than their disrespect." Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had thought her struggles were invisible, her small humiliations private. "You have been in Dillon for 6 months. I come down from the mountains every few weeks for supplies," Garrett explained. "I have a cabin up near Bannock Creek, about a day's ride from here. When I am in town, I notice things. I see how the shopkeepers talk over you like you are not there, how the men tip their hats but do not really see you, how those boys in your class make your life difficult because their fathers told them school was a waste of time." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "But I also see how you keep showing up every morning, how you never give up on them, even when they give up on themselves. That takes a kind of courage most people do not have. So when I decided I needed to learn, there was never any question who I would ask to teach me." Ruth found herself blinking rapidly, surprised by the sudden sting of tears. In 6 months, no one in this town had truly seen her, had recognized her effort or acknowledged her struggle. She had been so lonely, so tired of pushing against the constant resistance. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice to say more. Garrett nodded once, a gesture that felt like a promise, then returned to his writing practice. The afternoon lessons went even better than the morning. Word had apparently spread during lunch that there was a mountain man in the school, and several students who normally skipped afternoon sessions showed up just to gawk. Ruth found herself teaching to a fuller classroom than she had seen in months, and while she knew curiosity about Garrett was the draw rather than enthusiasm for learning, she would take what she could get. She worked with the younger children on their reading while the older students did mathematics, and periodically checked on Garrett's progress. He was working through a basic primer, one meant for 6-year-olds, but he attacked it with the same focused intensity she imagined. He brought to tracking game through wilderness. When he struggled with a word, he sounded it out carefully, using the techniques she had taught at the beginning of the year that most of her students had ignored. At 3 o'clock, she dismissed the class. The children stampeded out with their usual enthusiasm for freedom, and once again Garrett remained behind. "You have questions about the lessons?" Ruth asked, gathering up slates and organizing papers. "Many," he admitted, "but I do not want to take more of your time than I have already bought." "Education is not just about the hours in the classroom, Mr. Cole. If you have questions, I am happy to answer them." They spent another hour going over the finer points of phonics, how certain letter combinations created specific sounds, why English spelling was so often inconsistent and frustrating. Garrett absorbed it all like a man dying of thirst finally finding water, asking intelligent questions and making connections that showed his mind was sharp, even if his education had been neglected. When the light began to fade and Ruth finally had to insist they stop for the day, Garrett stood and stretched, his head nearly brushing the rafters. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "Every weekday," Ruth confirmed. "Though I should warn you the material will get more challenging." "Good," Garrett said with a slight smile that transformed his stern features. "I am not afraid of hard work." He left through the schoolhouse door, ducking slightly to clear the frame, and Ruth watched through the window as he mounted a massive roan horse that looked like it had been bred for size and stamina. He rode out of town toward the mountains, his broad back straight and confident, and Ruth realized she was already looking forward to tomorrow. That evening, as she prepared a simple dinner in the small room she rented above the milliner's shop, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Sarah Brennan, mother of her student Sarah, holding a basket covered with a cloth. "Evening, Miss Reynolds," the woman said, her expression neutral. "I brought you some stew and fresh bread. Figured you might appreciate a hot meal." Ruth was surprised. Mrs. Brennan had never been overtly hostile, but she had never been particularly friendly either. "That is very kind of you, thank you. Heard you took on Garrett Cole as a student today," Mrs. Brennan continued, not quite meeting Ruth's eyes. "That was decent of you. He is a good man, even if he is rough around the edges. My husband says Cole is one of the few trappers who deals honest with everyone, including the Indians. Says a man like that deserves a chance to better himself." She thrust the basket into Ruth's hands and turned to go, then paused. "My Sarah says you are a fine teacher, Miss Reynolds. Best she has ever had. Just thought you should know that." Before Ruth could respond, Mrs. Brennan hurried down the stairs, leaving Ruth standing in the doorway with her mouth open and her heart suddenly lighter than it had been in months. The next morning, Ruth arrived at the schoolhouse to find Garrett already there, sitting on the front steps with a book open on his knees. He looked up as she approached, and she saw he had cleaned up somewhat, his hair pulled back into a tail at the nape of his neck, his face freshly shaved. "Morning, Miss Reynolds," he said, standing politely as she approached. "I hope you do not mind that I came early. I wanted to practice before class started." "Not at all," Ruth said, unlocking the door. "Is that the primer I gave you yesterday?" "Yes, madam. I have been working through it since dawn. I think I am starting to get the hang of these vowel sounds, but some of these words make no sense at all. Why is though not spelled like it sounds?" Ruth laughed, the sound surprising her. When was the last time she had laughed? "That is one of the great mysteries of the English language, Mr. Cole. I'm afraid you will just have to memorize the irregular ones. I have memorized every animal track in these mountains and what they mean, every plant that can heal or harm, every weather sign in the sky," Garrett said with determination. "I can memorize some stubborn words." The day fell into a pattern that would continue for the next week. Garrett arrived early and stayed late, soaking up knowledge with a hunger that inspired even Ruth's most reluctant students. Bobby Hutchins actually started volunteering answers, apparently unwilling to be shown up by the mountain man. The Martin twins raced to finish their assignments first. Even little Emma Mitchell worked harder, as if Garrett's dedication was contagious. Ruth found herself teaching with renewed energy, remembering why she had wanted to become a teacher in the first place. It was not about forcing unwilling minds to absorb facts. It was about unlocking potential, about showing people they were capable of more than they believed. And Garrett Cole was proving that with every lesson. He progressed rapidly, his adult mind able to make connections and patterns that children struggled with. By the end of the first week, he had mastered basic phonics and was reading simple sentences with growing confidence. His writing was still rough, the letters uneven and cramped, but it was legible and improving daily. "You are an excellent student," Ruth told him on Friday afternoon after the others had left. "I have rarely seen anyone work so hard." "I have rarely had anything worth working for besides survival," Garrett replied. "This feels different, important." He hesitated, then added, Would you allow me to take you to dinner tomorrow evening, Miss Reynolds, as a thank you for your teaching and your patience?" Ruth felt her heart skip. It was not unusual for grateful parents to offer her meals, but something about the way Garrett asked, the slight nervousness in his voice, made this feel different. "That would be lovely, Mr. Cole." "Garrett," he said, "if we are to have dinner together, I would be honored if you called me Garrett." "Then you must call me Ruth," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. "At least outside of school hours." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Saturday evening found Ruth more nervous than she had been since arriving in Montana. She had only 3 decent dresses, all practical and plain, but she chose the dark blue one that her sister had said brought out her eyes. She pinned up her brown hair, trying to tame the curls that always escaped their pins, and studied herself in the small mirror above her wash basin. She was 24 years old, neither beautiful nor plain, with a face her mother had called pleasant, and a figure that was trim from constant activity, but nothing remarkable. She had never been courted seriously, had never inspired poetry or grand gestures. The men in Philadelphia had found her too earnest, too intellectual, too interested in books and ideas to be properly feminine. She had made peace with spinsterhood, or so she told herself, channeling her energy into teaching instead of romance. But now, looking at her reflection and thinking about Garrett Cole's dark eyes and respectful manner, she felt something flutter in her chest that might have been hope. He arrived exactly on time, riding his massive roan horse and leading a smaller mare he had apparently borrowed for the occasion. He had dressed in clean clothes, dark trousers and a white shirt that made his tanned skin look even darker, and Ruth noticed several townspeople stopping to stare as he helped her mount. The only proper restaurant in Dillon was the dining room at the hotel, and Ruth felt self-conscious walking in on Garrett's arm. The room fell silent for a moment, forks pausing halfway to mouths, before conversation resumed at a slightly elevated volume. Ruth could feel the weight of curious eyes and speculative whispers. Garrett seemed oblivious or indifferent to the attention. He held her chair with careful courtesy, seated himself across from her, and studied the menu with the same concentration he brought to his lessons. "I have eaten in 3 restaurants in my entire life," he admitted. "I am not entirely sure what half these dishes are." "The roast chicken is usually reliable," Ruth suggested, charmed by his honesty, "and their potatoes are quite good." They ordered, and Ruth expected awkward silence, but Garrett proved to be an engaging conversationalist. He told her about his life in the mountains, describing the savage beauty of winter storms and spring thaws, the delicate politics of trading with various tribes, the satisfaction of living by his own skill and strength. "I left Ohio when I was 16, he explained. "My father was a farmer, expected me to take over the land when he died, but I felt suffocated by those flat fields and small horizons. I wanted something bigger, wilder, so I headed west and never looked back." "Do you regret it?" Ruth asked. "The solitary life, I mean." "Sometimes," Garrett admitted. "Winters can be long and lonely, and I have missed out on some things like learning to read as a child should. But mostly no. The mountains suit me. They are honest, harsh but fair. Nothing like the politics and pretense of towns and cities." He met her eyes across the table. "What about you, Ruth? What brought an educated Eastern woman to a rough place like Dillon?" Ruth chose her words carefully. "I wanted to make a difference, to teach somewhere I was needed, not just one more schoolmarm in a city where teachers are common. I thought here on the frontier education would be valued because it is scarce. But it is not," Garrett guessed. "Not by most," Ruth said quietly. "They see it as frivolous, unnecessary for people who work with their hands." They humor me because the law requires a school, but they do not actually believe in what I am trying to do." "They are fools," Garrett said bluntly. "I have been to places where men make fortunes, lose them, and die without ever understanding why. And I have met Indians with no formal education who could navigate by stars, heal with plants, and negotiate treaties that shamed our supposed civilized politicians. Education is not just about reading and writing. It is about having tools to understand the world and your place in it. Those townspeople do not value it because they have never been without it long enough to know what it costs." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes again. How was it that this mountain man, this supposedly rough and unlettered trapper, understood more about the purpose of education than all the supposedly civilized people she had met in Dillon? "Thank you," she said softly. "You cannot know what it means to hear someone say that." "I know what it is to be dismissed," Garrett said. "To have people look at you and see only what you lack, not what you offer. That is its own kind of cruelty." Their food arrived, and they ate while continuing to talk. Garrett asked her about Philadelphia, about her family, about the books she had read, and the ideas she cared about. Ruth found herself opening up in ways she rarely did, sharing her frustrations and hopes, her dreams of creating a real school with proper supplies and eager students, her loneliness in this harsh, beautiful place. "You are not alone anymore," Garrett said as they finished their meal. "Not if you do not wish to be." Ruth looked at him, at this extraordinary man who had walked into her classroom and somehow changed everything, and felt something settle into place in her heart. They walked slowly back to her room above the milliner's shop, leading the horses through streets turned silver by moonlight. At her door, Garrett handed her the mare's reins and stepped back, respecting her space. "I would like to do this again," he said, "if you are willing." "I am not a sophisticated man, Ruth. I cannot offer you fancy words or city manners, but I can offer you honesty, respect, and whatever I have that might make your life easier or happier." Ruth felt herself smiling, really smiling for what felt like the first time since leaving Philadelphia. "I would very much like to do this again, Garrett, and I think honesty and respect are worth far more than sophisticated manners." He smiled back, that rare expression that transformed his hard features, and tipped his hat. "Good night, then. I will see you Monday morning." Ruth climbed the stairs to her room, her heart light despite the steep steps, and fell asleep that night thinking about dark eyes and strong hands carefully forming letters on a slate. The next weeks passed in a blur of lessons and conversations, classroom hours and evening walks, reading primers and stolen glances that grew progressively less stolen as both Ruth and Garrett grew bolder in their affection. The town noticed, of course. Dillon was too small and too starved for entertainment for a romance to go unremarked. Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile started giving Ruth knowing smiles and extra measures when she bought sugar. Reverend Thomas made pointed references in his Sunday sermons about the civilizing power of good women on rough men, making Ruth blush to the roots of her hair. Even the students picked up on the change, though they were generally delighted rather than scandalized. Young Emma Mitchell started drawing pictures of her teacher and the mountain man and leaving them on Ruth's desk. Garrett continued to learn at an astonishing pace. By mid-October, he was reading at a fifth-grade level and writing clear if simple sentences. More impressively, he had started keeping a journal, documenting his observations of wildlife and weather patterns with the same attention to detail that made him an excellent trapper. "Look at this," he said one afternoon, showing Ruth a page filled with his cramped handwriting. "I wrote about seeing a golden eagle yesterday, how it hunted and where it nested. Before, I would just remember it. Now I can capture it in words, Preserve it so I can look back later and see patterns over seasons and years." "That is exactly what education should do," Ruth said warmly. "Give you tools to engage more deeply with what you already know and love." He looked at her with such intensity that her breath caught. "You have given me more than tools, Ruth. You have given me a future I did not know I could have." The autumn deepened, turning the mountains into tapestries of gold and scarlet. Garrett brought Ruth gifts from the wilderness, things she had never seen before. A perfect eagle feather, a piece of obsidian polished by a river until it shone like black glass, pine cones the size of her head from trees that grew only at certain elevations. He taught her to recognize animal tracks in the mud by the schoolhouse, to read weather in the behavior of birds, to understand the mountains not as a scenic backdrop, but as a living, complex system. In return, Ruth opened worlds of literature and history, reading to him in the evenings from books she had brought from Philadelphia. They worked through Robinson Crusoe together, Garrett fascinated by the parallels to his own survival experiences. She introduced him to poetry, watching his face transform with wonder as he heard Shakespeare and Whitman for the first time. "Words can do that?" he asked, after she read him a particularly vivid passage from Moby Dick. "Just words on a page, but I can see it, feel it, like I am there on the ship." "That is the power of good writing," Ruth said. "It creates experience, shares consciousness across distance and time." "I want to learn to do that," Garrett said with determination. "Not just write what I see, but make others see it the way I do." "Then we will work on descriptive writing," Ruth promised, delighted by his enthusiasm. The first snow fell in early November, a light dusting that made the town look clean and new. Ruth woke to find Garrett already at the schoolhouse, having ridden down before dawn to make sure the path was safe and to build up the fire so the room would be warm when she arrived. "You did not have to do that," she protested, even as she appreciated the warmth. "I wanted to," Garrett said simply. "I want to do things for you, Ruth. I want to make your life easier any way I can." He paused, then added with uncharacteristic hesitancy, "I have been thinking. The trail to my cabin will be impassable once the heavy snows hit. I usually spend winters alone in the mountains, trapping and waiting for spring. But this year, I am considering staying in town. Renting a room, maybe finding work to cover expenses, so I can continue my lessons, so I can continue seeing you." Ruth felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "I would like that very much." "There is more," Garrett continued, and now he was definitely nervous, his hands fidgeting with his hat brim. "Ruth, I am not a man who knows how to speak fancy. But these past months with you have been the best of my life. You are brilliant and brave and kinder than anyone I have ever met. You see me, really see me, not just the rough exterior or the ignorant trapper. You make me want to be better, to know more, to deserve the respect you show me." He took a deep breath. "I am falling in love with you, Ruth Reynolds. Maybe I already have fallen, and I needed you to know that before the winter traps us in place and I lose my courage." Ruth found herself smiling even as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I am falling in love with you too, Garrett Cole. You walked into my classroom and changed my entire life. You showed me that my work matters, that I matter. You see me too, all the parts I thought I had to hide to be taken seriously. And I have never been happier than I am when I am with you." Garrett closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his large hands coming up to cup her face with surprising gentleness. "May I kiss you, please?" Ruth whispered, and then his lips were on hers, warm and soft and perfect. It was not Ruth's first kiss. She had been kissed before, hasty, uncomfortable embraces at church socials that had left her wondering what all the fuss was about. But this was different. This was rightness settling into her bones, completion she had not known she was missing. Garrett kissed her like she was precious, like she was something to be cherished and protected, and Ruth felt herself melting into his strength. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this proper," he said. "Court you the right way, even if I do not fully know what that means. Marry you if you will have me. Build a life together where we can both be ourselves and be valued for it." "Yes," Ruth said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." The students arrived to find their teacher, and the mountain man sitting decorously apart, but unable to stop smiling at each other. And word spread through town before lunchtime that there was to be a wedding come spring. The winter that followed was the coldest in recent memory, but Ruth barely noticed. Garrett rented a room at the boarding house and found work helping the blacksmith, whose age and rheumatism made the heavy labor increasingly difficult. His strength made him valuable, and his growing literacy allowed him to keep books and manage orders, earning him respect and steady pay. He came to the schoolhouse every day without fail, continuing his education with focus that never wavered. By Christmas, he was reading at a high school level, working through mathematics beyond simple arithmetic, writing essays that showed real thought and skill. Ruth was constantly amazed by his progress, by the sharp mind that had been hidden behind lack of opportunity. They spent their evenings together whenever propriety allowed, sometimes at the hotel restaurant, more often just walking through the snow-covered streets talking about everything and nothing. Garrett told her stories of his years in the mountains, adventures and near disasters that made her heart race with retrospective fear. Ruth shared her dreams for the school, ideas she had never spoken aloud about building a real library, about starting adult education classes, about maybe even opening a small college someday. "You will do it," Garrett said with absolute confidence. "You have the vision and the determination. You just needed someone to believe in you the way you believe in your students." "I have that now," Ruth said, squeezing his hand. "I have you." Garrett proposed officially on Christmas Eve, with a ring he had crafted himself from silver he had mined from a creek bed and polished to a bright shine. He got down on one knee in the snow outside the church after the Christmas service, in front of half the town, and asked Ruth to be his wife in a voice that shook with emotion. "I am not promising you an easy life," he said. "I am still learning to be civilized, and I will always be more comfortable in the wilderness than in a parlor. But I will love you with everything I am, Ruth Reynolds. I will respect your mind, support your dreams, and stand beside you against anyone who tries to diminish you. Will you marry me?" Ruth, crying openly now, said yes loud enough for everyone to hear. The wedding was planned for April, when the mountain passes would be clear and Ruth's family could travel from Philadelphia. Her mother wrote expressing surprise that her bookish daughter had managed to catch the attention of any man, let alone one who sounded so devoted, and Ruth bit back irritation at the backhanded compliment. Her father was more enthusiastic, pleased that Ruth would have someone to provide for her even if her teaching position did not work out. "They do not understand," Ruth told Garrett as they read the letters together. "They think you are rescuing me from spinsterhood, not that we are choosing each other as equals." "Let them think what they want," Garrett said, unbothered. "We know the truth. That is what matters." As winter gave way to early spring, Garrett surprised Ruth by presenting her with a carefully handwritten document, several pages long. "What is this?" she asked, unfolding the papers. "A prenuptial agreement," Garrett said. "I have been learning about law and property rights. Did you know that when we marry, anything you own legally becomes mine? Your salary, your books, even your clothes technically belong to your husband under territorial law." Ruth nodded slowly. This was not news to her, just one more indignity women faced that she had learned to accept. "I am not accepting it," Garrett said firmly. "This document states that all property you bring to the marriage remains yours, that your teaching salary is yours to control, that any inheritance from your family is yours alone. I had a lawyer in Virginia City draw it up proper. It might not hold up in court, but it is my promise to you that I will never use the law to control you or take what is yours." Ruth looked at the document, then at this extraordinary man who kept finding new ways to astound her. "You did this for me. I did this for us," Garrett corrected. "I fell in love with you because you are intelligent and strong and independent. I'm not marrying you to change those things or to own you. I am marrying you to build a partnership where we both thrive." Ruth set down the papers and kissed him thoroughly, not caring that they were standing in broad daylight on Dillon's Main Street, where anyone could see. Her family arrived in mid-April, her parents and younger sister traveling by train to Utah and then by stage the rest of the way. They looked exhausted and disheveled from the journey, and Ruth could see her mother taking in the rough buildings and muddy streets of Dillon with barely concealed dismay. "Oh, Ruth," her mother said after they had settled into the hotel, "is this really where you have been living?" "It is so very rustic. It is home," Ruth said simply, "and I love it here." She introduced them to Garrett that evening at dinner, watching nervously as her father assessed the mountain man with a stern eye. Garrett was wearing his best clothes and was freshly shaved, but there was no disguising his size or the rough edges that marked him as a creature of wilderness rather than civilization. But Garrett was also articulate and courteous, answering her father's pointed questions with honesty and dignity. He spoke about his work, his growing business prospects now that he could read and write, his plans to build Ruth a comfortable home where she could continue teaching as long as she wished. "And you support her working after marriage?" Ruth's father asked, clearly surprised. "Of course," Garrett said. "Ruth is an excellent teacher. The children of this town are fortunate to have her, and she finds meaning in the work. I would never ask her to give that up." Ruth saw her mother and father exchange glances, the silent communication of a long marriage. Her sister Emily, 19 and still unmarried herself, was staring at Garrett with obvious fascination. "Mr. Cole," her father finally said, "you are not the sort of man I imagined for my daughter, but I can see you care for her and she clearly cares for you. You have my blessing." The wedding took place on a brilliant spring morning, the mountains still snow-capped but the valley floor carpeted with wildflowers. Reverend Thomas officiated in the small church, which was packed with what seemed like the entire town. Ruth wore a simple white dress her mother had brought from Philadelphia, and Garrett wore a new suit that made him look only slightly less like he might bolt for the wilderness at any moment. Bobby Hutchins and the other students served as ushers, clearly taking their responsibilities with utmost seriousness. Little Emma Mitchell was the flower girl, scattering petals with great concentration. Sarah Brennan and several other older students sang hymns that made Ruth's eyes sting with tears. When Garrett took her hands and spoke his vows, his deep voice steady and sure, Ruth felt the rightness of this moment in every fiber of her being. This was meant to be. These two people, so different in background and experience, fitting together like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to be assembled. "I promise to honor you, respect you, and love you for all the days of my life," Garrett said. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams, and to never take for granted the gift you have given me by choosing me. You are my teacher, my love, and my equal. This I swear before God and these witnesses." Ruth's own vows were similarly heartfelt, And when Reverend Thomas finally pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was chaste but full of promise. The reception was held in the schoolhouse, which had been decorated with ribbons and flowers by Ruth's students. There was food contributed by half the town, fiddle music provided by old Tom Crawford, who had played at every wedding in Dillon for 20 years, and dancing that grew increasingly enthusiastic as the evening wore on. Ruth danced with her father, with Bobby Hutchins, who blushed furiously the entire time, with several town fathers who congratulated her on her marriage with what seemed like genuine warmth. But mostly she danced with Garrett, who moved with surprising grace for such a large man, his hand warm and secure at her waist. "Happy," he murmured as they swayed together. "Happier than I knew I could be," Ruth replied honestly. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, and if Ruth was nervous about the physical intimacy ahead, Garrett's gentleness and patience quickly put her at ease. He made love to her with the same focused attention he brought to everything, learning what pleased her, moving with restraint and care until she relaxed into pleasure she had never imagined. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Ruth felt complete in a way she had never experienced. This was partnership. This was love. "I have a surprise for you," Garrett said, his deep voice rumbling through his chest. "I bought land. 20 acres about 2 miles from town, with a creek and good timber. I am going to build us a house this summer. Nothing fancy but solid and comfortable, with a room you can use for a study or a library." "You bought land," Ruth said, surprised. "When?" "Been working toward it all winter," Garrett admitted. "Been saving everything I earned, plus I sold my silver claim. I want to give you a real home, Ruth, a place that is ours." "Anywhere with you is home," Ruth said softly, "but a house of our own sounds wonderful." They returned from their brief wedding trip to discover that Ruth's classroom had been transformed. The school board, apparently motivated by guilt or perhaps by the respect Garrett had earned, had authorized funds for new desks, proper blackboards, and a small library of books. There was even a globe, something Ruth had been requesting since she arrived. "Did you have anything to do with this?" Ruth asked Garrett suspiciously. "I may have suggested to a few influential people that investing in education was investing in the future of the town," Garrett said with studied innocence. "And I may have pointed out that towns with good schools attract better settlers and higher property values. Pure self-interest on their part." Ruth laughed and kissed him. "My cunning husband." The remainder of the school year passed quickly. Garrett continued attending classes even after the wedding, though now he was helping Ruth teach as much as learning himself. He worked particularly well with the boys who had always given Ruth trouble, commanding their respect with his quiet authority, and showing them by example that there was no shame in learning from a woman. Bobby Hutchins, who had been such a problem student, flourished under Garrett's mentorship and started talking about maybe becoming a surveyor, a profession that would require both literacy and mathematics. The Martin twins stopped fighting and started competing over grades instead. Even lazy Timothy Crow showed improvement, apparently unwilling to disappoint the mountain man who spoke to him like he had potential. When summer came and school let out, Garrett threw himself into building their house with the same determination he had brought to learning his letters. He hired a few men from town to help, but did most of the work himself, rising before dawn and working until dark. Ruth visited the construction site whenever she could, bringing lunch and watching in fascination as walls rose and a roof took shape. The house was not large, but it was well built and thoughtful. There were windows positioned to catch morning and afternoon light, a large stone fireplace for winter warmth, and true to his promise, a separate room for Ruth's books and papers. Garrett carved their initials into the lintel above the door, along with the date, RC and GC, April 1877. They moved in on a hot July day, their few possessions easily filling the space. Ruth arranged her books on shelves Garrett had built, hung curtains her mother had sent, and transformed the house into a home. That night, they sat on the porch Garrett had constructed, watching the sun set over the mountains and listening to the creek babble nearby. "I never thought I could be this happy," Ruth said, leaning against Garrett's shoulder. "Never imagined this life was possible. I spent 15 years thinking I was happy alone in the mountains," Garrett replied. "I did not know what I was missing. Did not know that having someone to share your life with, someone who sees and values you, could make everything more vivid and meaningful." He paused, then added quietly, "You saved me, Ruth. Not just by teaching me to read, but by showing me there was more to life than survival. You gave me purpose." "We saved each other," Ruth corrected. "You reminded me why I became a teacher. You showed me I was not foolish to believe education matters. And you loved me for exactly who I am, not for who you wanted me to be." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars began to emerge, so many stars that Ruth could never have imagined them in Philadelphia. The vastness of the Montana sky no longer intimidated her. It felt like freedom. School resumed in September, and Ruth discovered that her reputation had changed dramatically. Parents who had once been dismissive now greeted her with respect. The school board approved her requests for supplies without argument. New families moving to the area specifically sought her out, having heard there was a good school in Dillon. Part of this was certainly due to Garrett's influence and the respect he commanded in the community. But part of it was also Ruth's own growing confidence, the way she carried herself now that she knew her worth. She was no longer the uncertain young teacher trying desperately to prove herself. She was Ruth Cole, educator and partner, woman with a place and a purpose. Garrett had transitioned from student to assistant teacher, officially hired by the school board to help with the older students and to teach practical skills like surveying and woodcraft. His presence in the classroom was no longer a curiosity, but an accepted part of the school's structure, and Ruth loved watching him work with students who would never have listened to her alone. Together they made a formidable team, Ruth teaching academics and critical thinking, Garrett teaching practical applications and showing students how education connected to real life. Their enrollment grew steadily, and by the winter of 1877, they had over 30 students ranging from 6 to 20 years old. In December, Ruth discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but waited to be certain before telling Garrett, unsure how he would react to the news. When she finally told him one evening as they prepared dinner together, his face transformed with such pure joy that her remaining anxiety evaporated. "A child," he said wonderingly, placing his large hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child. Ruth, are you happy about this?" "I am terrified and thrilled and overwhelmed," Ruth admitted. "But yes, I am happy. Are you?" "I am more than happy," Garrett said, pulling her into a careful embrace. "I am grateful, honored, awed that we get to create a life together that some part of us will continue into the future." He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "And I promise you will not have to choose between being a mother and being a teacher. We will figure it out together. Maybe my mother can come help after the baby is born, or we can hire someone, whatever you need to keep doing the work you love." Ruth felt tears slip down her cheeks. How had she gotten so lucky? How had this rough mountain man turned out to have a more progressive view of marriage and motherhood than most educated Eastern men? "I love you," she whispered. "So very much." "I love you too," Garrett replied. You and this baby. My family. I never thought I would have a family." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Ruth taught until late spring when the physical demands became too taxing. The school board, with Garrett's strong encouragement, agreed to hire a temporary replacement for the remaining weeks of the school year, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson who had taught in Denver before retiring to Dillon. Their daughter was born on a warm June evening in 1878, delivered by the town's doctor with Garrett holding Ruth's hand throughout the long labor. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and wailing with healthy lungs, Ruth watched Garrett's face as the doctor placed their daughter in his arms. The mountain man, who had faced blizzards and grizzly bears without flinching, looked absolutely terrified holding this tiny human. His hands, so large and scarred and capable, cradled her with infinite gentleness as tears streamed down his face. "She is perfect," he whispered. "So small and perfect." They named her Grace Ellen Cole, and she transformed their lives completely. Ruth had worried she might regret stepping away from teaching even temporarily, but she found herself utterly enchanted with motherhood. Grace was an easy baby, content to sleep in a basket in the schoolhouse when Ruth returned to teaching that fall, nursed during breaks and nap times. The students were fascinated by the baby, and Ruth found herself teaching impromptu lessons about infant development and childcare, along with reading and arithmetic. Garrett, who could track animals for miles and survive on his own in wilderness, proved equally adept at changing diapers and soothing a fussy baby, much to the amazement of the town's more traditional residents. "You are making other husbands look bad," Ruth teased him one evening as he walked the floor with Grace, singing to her in a surprisingly tuneful voice. "Other husbands should do better," Garrett replied without apology. "This is my daughter. Why would I not want to care for her?" The years that followed were full and rich, marked by small triumphs and quiet joys. The school continued to grow, eventually requiring Ruth to hire additional teachers as enrollment exceeded what one person could manage. Garrett took over teaching older students full-time, focusing on advanced mathematics, science, and practical skills that prepared young men and women for professions beyond farming and ranching. Grace grew into a bright, curious child who could read by 4 and who treated the schoolhouse as her second home. She had Ruth's brown curls and Garrett's dark eyes, and a personality that combined her mother's determination with her father's quiet confidence. In 1880, Ruth gave birth to a son they named James, who proved to be as sturdy and good-natured as his father. 2 years later, another daughter arrived, Caroline, completing their family. The house Garrett had built was expanded to accommodate the growing family, and the sounds of children's laughter filled the rooms. Ruth sometimes thought back to her lonely first months in Dillon, when she had felt so dismissed and discouraged. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like it had happened to a different person. That uncertain young teacher barely resembled the confident woman she had become, wife and mother and respected educator who had helped transform the town's attitude toward learning. And it had all started with a mountain man ducking through her schoolhouse door, asking to learn. Garrett had long since surpassed basic literacy. He read voraciously now, everything from technical manuals to philosophy to novels. He had taught himself enough law to help other trappers and small businessmen understand contracts and protect themselves from exploitation. He wrote articles about wildlife management and conservation that were published in territorial papers. He had become a respected voice in the community, someone people turned to for wisdom and fairness. But he never forgot what it felt like to be ignorant, to be dismissed, because of what he lacked. And he never stopped being grateful to Ruth for seeing past his rough exterior to the person underneath. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1887, Garrett presented Ruth with a leather-bound book. She opened it to find it was a journal, every page filled with his handwriting, now smooth and confident. "I have been writing our story," he explained. "Everything from the day I walked into your classroom to now. I wanted our children to know how we met, how you changed my life, how much I love you. So they would understand that education is not just about facts and figures. It is about possibility. It is about seeing people's potential and helping them reach it." Ruth read through the pages, tears streaming down her face as she saw their life together documented in Garrett's clear prose. He had captured everything, the uncertainty and hope of those early days, the growing love, the challenges they had faced and overcome together. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "You have become such a good writer, Garrett." "I had an excellent teacher," he replied with a smile, "the best there is." That evening, after their children were asleep and the house was quiet, Ruth and Garrett sat together on their porch as they had done countless times before. Garrett's hair was now streaked with gray, and Ruth had lines around her eyes from years of smiling. They were no longer young, but their love had only deepened with time. "Do you ever regret it?" Ruth asked. "Giving up the solitary mountain life for town living and family?" "Never," Garrett said immediately. "That was existing, Ruth. This is living. You taught me the difference." He took her hand, his grip still strong after all these years. "I was a mountain man who knew how to survive in wilderness. You taught me how to thrive in the world, how to be part of a community, how to be a husband, a father, a teacher. You gave me everything that matters." "You gave me just as much," Ruth replied. "You showed me my work had value when everyone else dismissed it. You loved me for my mind as much as anything else. You made me believe I could make a difference, and that belief changed everything." They sat together as stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, listening to the creek and the wind in the pines, surrounded by the life they had built together. 3 children sleeping safely inside. A town that valued education because they had shown the way. A partnership built on mutual respect and deep, abiding love. In the distance, the mountains rose dark against the twilight, beautiful and eternal. Those mountains had been Garrett's home for so many years, had shaped him into the man he became, but they were no longer where he belonged. Home was here, in this house he had built with his own hands, with this woman who had taught him that strength came in many forms, and that the greatest adventures were the ones you shared. Ruth leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling his warmth and solidity, and thought about the teacher she had been when she first arrived in Dillon, desperate for respect and validation. She had thought respect had to be demanded, fought for, earned through persistence alone. But Garrett had taught her something different. Respect was given freely when you treated others with dignity, when you saw their worth and helped them see it too. She had walked into that schoolhouse every day trying to prove herself worthy of respect. Garrett had walked in and simply offered it, recognizing her value without needing her to justify it. And in doing so, he had shown the entire town how she deserved to be treated. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything, for seeing me, for choosing me." "Thank you for teaching me," Garrett replied. "Not just reading and writing, but how to be fully human, how to love, how to build something that lasts." They stayed there until the stars were bright enough to cast shadows, reluctant to break the perfect peace of the moment. Tomorrow there would be lessons to plan and children to feed, and a dozen small tasks that made up the fabric of their life. But tonight, there was just this. 2 people who had found each other against unlikely odds, who had built a partnership that honored them both, who had created a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. The schoolhouse in Dillon would stand for generations, and Ruth's methods would influence teachers throughout the territory. Garrett's conservation efforts would help preserve wilderness areas for future generations. Their children would grow up to be respected professionals, who treated everyone with the dignity their parents had taught them was every person's due. But none of that was as important as this moment, this connection, this love that had transformed two lonely people into something greater than the sum of their parts. The mountain man and the teacher, the student and the mentor, the husband and wife. They had learned from each other, grown together, and built a life that honored the best in both of them. And it had all started with a simple act of respect, of one person seeing another's worth and choosing to honor it. As they finally rose to go inside, hand in hand, Ruth looked back once at the mountains silhouetted against the stars. They were beautiful, those wild peaks that had been Garrett's first love. But they were also distant, separate, unchanged by time or care. This, what they had built together, was better than beautiful. It was alive, it was growing, it was real, and it was theirs. Years continued to pass in their steady rhythm, seasons turning and children growing, and Ruth and Garrett grew older together with the comfortable ease of two people who genuinely liked each other as much as they loved each other. Grace proved to have inherited her mother's passion for teaching, and by 18 was helping instruct the younger students while studying to become a certified teacher herself. James, sturdy and practical like his father, showed an aptitude for engineering and talked about building bridges and railways across the expanding territories. Young Caroline combined both parents' traits, brilliant and strong-willed, determined to become a doctor despite the considerable obstacles facing women in medicine. The school in Dillon had expanded into a proper academy by 1890, with 4 full-time teachers and over 70 students. Ruth served as headmistress, a position of genuine authority that came with respect hard-earned over more than a decade of excellent results. Students who passed through her school went on to universities, to professions, to lives shaped by the education she had fought so hard to provide. And through it all, Garrett remained her partner and support, teaching advanced classes and serving on the Territorial Education Board, using his influence to expand educational opportunities throughout Montana. The mountain man who had once signed contracts he could not read was now helping write educational policy, and he never missed an opportunity to credit Ruth for making it possible. On a crisp autumn morning in 1895, Ruth stood at the schoolhouse window watching students arrive for another day of classes. She was 47 now, her hair shot through with silver, her face lined with the marks of a life well lived. Garrett stood behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders, his presence as solid and reassuring as it had been the day they met. "You remember," she asked softly, "that first morning when you walked through that door and asked me to teach you?" "I remember being terrified," Garrett admitted. "Terrified you would laugh at me or turn me away. Terrified of revealing how ignorant I was. But I was more terrified of spending the rest of my life unable to read, unable to protect myself from men who would cheat me because I did not know any better." He turned her gently to face him. "And then you said yes. You looked at me with respect, like I was worth teaching even though I was a grown man who should have learned as a child. You gave me dignity when I expected pity or contempt. That changed everything, Ruth. Not just my ability to read, but my entire understanding of what I could be." "You were always worthy," Ruth said firmly. "You were always more than circumstances allowed you to become. I just gave you tools, you did the rest." "We did it together," Garrett corrected. "Everything we have, we built together." Their children had brought partners home to meet them over the years, and now there were grandchildren, 4 of them so far, filling the house with noise and chaos and joy. Grace had married a schoolteacher from Helena, a kind man who shared her passion for education. James was engaged to an engineer's daughter who could calculate load-bearing equations faster than most men could tie their boots. Caroline was courting a young doctor who had the good sense to treat her as an intellectual equal. Ruth and Garrett's house had become a gathering place for the family. Sunday dinners crowded and loud and perfect. Multiple generations talking and laughing and debating around the table Garrett had built 2 decades earlier. The legacy they were creating was not just in the school or the town, but in these children and grandchildren who had been raised to value knowledge, respect ability regardless of gender, and understand that education was the foundation of freedom. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the town of Dillon threw them a celebration at the school. It seemed the entire community turned out, former students now adults with children of their own, families who credited Ruth and Garrett's teaching with transforming their prospects, town leaders who acknowledged the couple's enormous contribution to the community's growth and reputation. Bobby Hutchins, now a successful surveyor with his own business, stood to give a speech that made Ruth's eyes sting with tears. Miss Reynolds, Mrs. Cole now, she never gave up on us even when we gave her every reason to. And when Garrett Cole walked into that classroom and showed us that learning was not weakness but strength, that asking questions was courage not ignorance, everything changed. They taught us more than reading and writing and figures. They taught us to be better people. This town owes them a debt we cannot repay. The celebration continued late into the evening, with music and dancing and stories about the impact Ruth and Garrett had made over the years. When it finally ended and they walked home through streets lit by electric lights, a modern convenience that had arrived just that year, Ruth felt overwhelming gratitude for the life they had built. 25 years, Garrett marveled as they reached their porch. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday I walked through that schoolhouse door. Sometimes it feels like you have always been part of my life. Both things can be true, Ruth said, taking his hand. Time is strange that way. They sat together on the porch, a habit so ingrained it felt like breathing, and looked up at stars mostly obscured now by the glow of town lights. Dillon had grown from a rough frontier settlement to a proper town with electricity, telegraph lines, regular train service. The wild edges were being tamed, the wilderness pushed further back. Sometimes Ruth missed the raw simplicity of those early years, when everything was new and uncertain and full of possibility. But she would not trade the life they had built, the depth and richness that came from years of partnership and shared purpose. "You ever wish you had stayed in the mountains?" she asked, a question she had asked before over the years, always wanting to be certain Garrett had no regrets. "The mountains are still there," Garrett replied, his standard answer. "I can visit whenever I want, but my life is here with you, has been since the moment you agreed to teach me. The greatest adventure I ever had was not surviving alone in the wilderness. It was building a life with you, raising our children, shaping this community into something better. That required more courage and strength than anything I did as a trapper." He squeezed her hand. "You taught me that real bravery is not about conquering nature or proving how tough you are. It is about being vulnerable enough to admit what you do not know, to ask for help, to let someone see your weaknesses. That first day, walking into your classroom and admitting I could not read, that was the scariest and bravest thing I had ever done. And you taught me that strength comes in many forms," Ruth replied. That the respect I craved could not be demanded but had to be earned through consistency and excellence. That the right partner does not complete you but challenges you to be more than you thought you could be. They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had built something lasting from mutual respect and genuine love. The years continued their march as years do. Ruth eventually retired from daily teaching at 55, though she remained involved with the school as an advisor and advocate. Garrett scaled back his own teaching to spend more time with grandchildren, and to write the book on wildlife conservation and sustainable trapping he had been planning for years. They traveled some, visiting Grace in Helena and James in Seattle, where he was building the bridges he had always dreamed about. They watched Caroline become one of the first female doctors practicing in Montana, fighting every step of the way for the right to use her education to help people. On a summer evening in 1905, Ruth and Garrett celebrated their 31st wedding anniversary with their children and grandchildren. 8 grandchildren now ranging from infants to teenagers. The house was full of life and noise. 3 generations of Coles gathered around tables laden with food, telling stories and making memories. Grace's oldest daughter, Ruth's namesake, was preparing to attend university to study education like her grandmother. James's son wanted to be an engineer like his father. Caroline's daughter, barely 10 years old, already declared she would be a doctor like her mother. The legacy continued, each generation building on what had come before. As the evening wound down and family members departed, Ruth stood at the window watching them go, these people who existed because she and Garrett had found each other. She felt Garrett's presence behind her before his arms came around her waist, pulling her back against his solid warmth. "We did well," he said quietly. "Look at them. Look at what we built." "We did," Ruth agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Better than I ever imagined." They were in their 60s now, still healthy but showing the inevitable marks of age. Garrett's hair was fully gray, his face weathered by years of outdoor work even after he had settled into town life. Ruth's hands showed the beginnings of arthritis, making writing more difficult than it once was, but they were here together, surrounded by love and legacy. "Remember that first day?" Garrett asked, a question that had become ritual between them over the years. "What did you think when I walked into your classroom?" "I thought you were the largest man I had ever seen," Ruth said honestly. "I thought you might be there to cause trouble. And then you said you wanted to learn, and I saw something in your eyes that made me believe you meant it. Desperation, maybe. Determination. Hope." She turned in his arms to face him. "I had no idea that man would become my husband, my partner, the father of my children. I had no idea he would change my entire life." "I knew," Garrett said with a slight smile. "Maybe not that first day, but soon after. I knew you were extraordinary. I knew I wanted to be worthy of your respect. And I knew that if you would let me, I would spend my life loving you." "You have," Ruth said softly. "You have loved me so well, Garrett, better than I knew I could be loved." They kissed, the familiar comfort of lips that had met thousands of times over 3 decades, and Ruth felt the same flutter in her chest she had felt as a young woman. Some things never changed. Some love never faded. The years grew shorter as they moved into their 70s, time seeming to accelerate even as their bodies slowed. Ruth's arthritis worsened, making daily tasks more difficult. Garrett developed a persistent cough that worried everyone, despite his insistence he was fine. But they adapted, helping each other through the challenges of aging with the same partnership that had sustained them for 40 years. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1917, their children threw them another celebration. this time in the much expanded school that now bore Ruth's name. The Reynolds Cole Academy had become one of the finest schools in Montana, and Ruth's former students held positions of influence throughout the state. The governor himself attended the celebration, giving a speech about how Ruth and Garrett's commitment to education had helped transform Montana from rough territory to respectable state. Former students stood to testify about how their lives had been changed by the couple's teaching. Grandchildren, now young adults themselves, spoke about the values their grandparents had instilled. "You taught us that education is not just about getting ahead," young Ruth said, now 22 and teaching at her grandmother's academy. "It is about becoming fully human, about understanding our place in the world and our responsibility to make it better. You showed us that love is not just romance but partnership, mutual respect, shared purpose. You lived the values you taught, and that matters more than any lesson from a book." When the speeches ended and the celebration moved into dinner and dancing, Ruth found herself dancing with Garrett one more time, moving slowly to accommodate old bones and tired bodies. But the joy was the same, the connection as strong as it had been when they were young and the future was all possibility. 40 years, Garrett marveled. "How did we get here so quickly?" "One day at a time," Ruth replied. "One lesson, one conversation, one choice to love each other well. It adds up to a lifetime." "The best lifetime," Garrett said. "No regrets, Ruth, not one." "No regrets," Ruth agreed. "Only gratitude." They knew, without speaking of it, that their time was growing short. Garrett's cough had been diagnosed as something serious, something the doctors could not fix. Ruth's heart was weakening, each beat a little harder than the last. But they faced this final challenge as they had faced everything else, together and without fear. "I am not afraid of dying," Garrett told Ruth one evening as they sat on their beloved porch, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. "But I am afraid of leaving you alone." "I have never been alone since you walked into my classroom," Ruth said. "Even when you are gone, you will still be with me. In our children, in the school, in every student whose life we touched. You cannot leave me, Garrett, not really. You are part of me now." "And you are part of me," Garrett replied. "The best part, the part that made everything else possible." Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep in December of 1917, his hand clasped in Ruth's. The entire town mourned him, this mountain man who had become an educator, advocate, and friend to so many. His funeral was attended by hundreds, people whose lives he had touched over 4 decades of teaching and community service. Ruth spoke at the service, her voice steady despite her grief. "Garrett Cole walked into my classroom 41 years ago, a grown man asking a young woman to teach him to read. That took courage most people do not possess. He could have hidden his ignorance, pretended he did not need help. Instead, he admitted what he did not know and asked for tools to grow. That single act of courage changed both our lives and the lives of everyone in this room." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "Garrett taught me that respect is not something you demand, but something you offer. That real strength is being vulnerable enough to learn. That education is not weakness but the foundation of freedom. And that love is not about completing each other, but about challenging each other to be more. I was a better teacher, a better person because of him. This town was better because of him. And every student who passed through our classrooms was better for his influence." She touched the simple wooden coffin one last time. "Thank you, my love, for seeing me, for choosing me, for 41 years of partnership and purpose. I will see you again when my time comes. Until then, I will carry you with me in everything I do." Ruth lived for 3 more years, still active in the academy, still teaching occasional classes when her health permitted, still fierce in her advocacy for education and opportunity. She saw Caroline's daughter graduate from medical school, saw James's son complete his first major bridge project, saw young Ruth receive an award for excellence in teaching. The legacy continued, generation after generation, building on what Ruth and Garrett had started. On a spring morning in 1920, Ruth passed away quietly in the house Garrett had built, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She was 72 years old and had lived a full, rich life of purpose and love. At her funeral, young Ruth spoke about her grandmother's impact. She taught us that one person can make a difference, that education is power, that respect must be offered freely and earned through excellence. She never stopped fighting for her students, never stopped believing in the transformative power of knowledge. And she showed us what real partnership looks like, what it means to build a life based on mutual respect and shared values. She smiled through her tears. Grandma Ruth used to tell me about the day Grandpa Garrett walked into her classroom, how scared she was that this enormous mountain man would cause trouble, how amazed she was when he asked to learn. She said that moment changed everything, that sometimes your whole life pivots on a single choice. Garrett chose to honor her as a teacher. She chose to see his potential. And from those choices came 41 years of love, 3 children, 8 grandchildren, 4 great-grandchildren, and a legacy that will continue long after we are all gone. Ruth was buried beside Garrett on a hillside overlooking the mountains he had once called home, with a view of the town they had helped build. The headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates and a single inscription. They taught us to see each other clearly and love each other well. The Reynolds Cole Academy continued to thrive, growing into a comprehensive school system that eventually served thousands of students. Ruth's methods influenced education throughout the region, and several of her former students became prominent educators themselves, spreading her philosophy of respect, excellence, and opportunity. Grace taught for 45 years, eventually becoming state superintendent of education. James built bridges that connected communities across the Northwest. Caroline practiced medicine until she was 70, treating patients who could not afford doctors and training young women who faced the same obstacles she had overcome. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried forward the values they had learned, understanding that education was not just about personal advancement, but about creating a better world. That respect was something you gave freely, not something you withheld until it was earned. That the best partnerships were built on equality and mutual admiration. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew down from the mountains and rustled through the pines around that hillside cemetery, people swore they could feel the presence of the teacher and the mountain man who had started it all. 2 people who had found each other against unlikely odds, who had built something lasting from respect and love, who had shown an entire community what was possible when you honored each other's worth. The story of Ruth Reynolds and Garrett Cole became local legend, told and retold with embellishment and emotion. But at its core, it remained a simple truth. One man walked into a classroom and asked to learn. One woman chose to teach him with respect and dignity. And from that single act of mutual honor came a lifetime of love, a legacy of education, and proof that the greatest adventures are not conquering wilderness or achieving fame, but finding someone who sees you clearly and choosing to build a life together based on that clear-eyed love. Their story lived on in the school that bore their names, in the students whose lives were changed by education, in the children and grandchildren who carried forward their values. It lived on in the idea that respect costs nothing but gives everything, that learning is strength, not weakness, That partnership means lifting each other up rather than tearing each other down. And sometimes, when a new teacher felt discouraged or a student felt hopeless, someone would tell them about the mountain man and the teacher, about how he walked into her classroom and honored her when no one else would, about how she taught him and loved him and built a legacy that lasted long after they were gone. Because that was the real lesson, the one that mattered more than reading or writing or arithmetic. That every person has worth. That respect offered freely can change lives. That love built on mutual honor and shared purpose can transform not just two people but entire communities. Ruth Reynolds and Garrett Cole understood that truth. They lived it every day for 41 years. And in doing so, they created something far more lasting than any monument or memorial. They created a love story that would inspire generations, proving that the most powerful force in the world is not strength or knowledge or ambition, but simply choosing to see another person clearly and honor the worth you find there. That was their legacy. That was their gift. And that was their story.